Okay, hello everybody and welcome to this first African Cocoa Marketplace webinar on Forest and Farmers First. We'll be looking at EUDR compliance solutions. It's hosted by ACM, as I mentioned, along with its partners Origin, Dementa Holdings and Aya Data. I'm Anthony Myers, your moderator, and today we're joined by Dr. Kristy Leissle, founder and CEO of African Cocoa Marketplace, which connects buyers and sellers of cocoa products from Africa. And also joining Kristy is Peter Murray, a South African property law expert who has argued cases before the South African High Court and who leads the legal compliance framework for Forests and Farmers First solutions. Now, this is purposely a short 30-minute webinar on the forthcoming EUDR to attempt to decipher the complexities and still unknown aspects of the regulations to hopefully give operators and producers a clear understanding of the EUDR as it stands today. Please feel free to type in your questions into a chat box. We'll try to answer as many as possible in the time allocated, and we may follow up after this as well. So keep, if you're not already following us on LinkedIn, please do for more updates. But time is of the essence, so let's begin with Kristy, who has been immersed in the new law for the past 12 months. So where are we at, Kristy?
Yeah, thanks very much, Tony. So it is been an ongoing process, I think, for both those who have to be compliant with the EUDR and those of us who are offering compliant solutions to work out exactly what the regulation specifies and what is kind of an additional type of compliance that we can show to really fulfill the spirit of this regulation. I think we are all really in alignment that we agree with the spirit of the EUDR. Like limiting deforestation is crucial globally, and I think this regulation gave everybody the needed push to really put resources behind it, to put effort and energy behind it. What has been more complicated is figuring out exactly, whether and how the data that is required by the regulation fulfills that purpose, and what additional types of data, what might we need to provide, and what other types of approaches or methods we need to use to really, really make the guarantee that forests have not been degraded or removed in any way in the supply chain for the EUDR relevant commodities.
Good, thank you. Peter, one of the burning questions that we'll try to answer throughout these next 30 minutes or so is, who is responsible for ensuring compliance? And I wondered if you could help us on that small technical matter.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks very much, everyone. Yes, it's unfortunately not a small and it is a very technical matter. And just to start off talking about the regulations, obviously these are not simple regulations, and I'm sure, as most of you have found going through the regulations, there is unfortunately some clumsy drafting, there is some contradiction, and it's not entirely easy to chart a clear way forward with the regulations and understand exactly what the legislators meant at every time. But just to boil it down, there's really two types of persons who are required to comply with the regulations. The first type of person, which is called an operator under the regulations, is the person who first places the product on the market within the EU. The second type of person who is required to comply is someone who's called a trader, and that's anyone else in the supply chain who then distributes that product, and whether it's a first distributor of the product or a second distributor of the product. The difficulty that comes in, firstly, from a terminological perspective, those two words don't work very naturally. But secondly, once you get into the heart of the regulations, there's not much to distinguish an importer from someone who distributes within the EU. So the same sort of compliance really does apply to both of those people. The importer, also important to understand that it's not just an importer, it's anyone who exports that product from the EU.
Okay, so is compliance a top-down or bottom-up scenario? This is again one of the crux of the problems, isn't it, or the confusion? How would you describe how would you describe that that kind of process?
Yeah, it's a difficult question, and before we jump into that, just another sorry to be dumping so many complexities on
Yeah.
everyone. A bit of an aberration, when you look at the title of the regulations, which are clearly aimed at preventing deforestation, clearly aimed at preventing degradation of forests. However, it's important to understand that there's an important component of the due diligence that I don't think many people are talking about, which is that the person who's carrying out the due diligence exercise also has to satisfy the EU authorities that that product has been produced in accordance with the laws of the land in which it was produced. And there's a very wide list given. So in other words, you have to comply with land use law, you have to comply with tax laws, labor law. So it's a fairly complex situation from a compliance perspective, and it's almost like there's this double layer of preventing deforestation, but also ensuring compliance with the laws of the land in which it was produced. But to answer your question, whether this is top down or how we describe this type of regulation, again, another one of the curiosities is that it's the first person in the EU who deals with the product has to carry out the due diligence exercise. And Kristy will tell us a little bit more, I'm sure, in a moment about what that due diligence process consists of. But it's the first person in the EU dealing with the product that has to carry out the due diligence. Then the due diligence kind of follows each person in the supply chain. However, if you are next in the supply chain and you're not the first person who has imported that product into the EU, you can't just rely on the due diligence that came before, even though it is acting as a bit of a passport. As you travel from country to country with your visa, you have to check that your visa is compliant. So each person who accepts that product in the supply chain has to take reasonable steps to ensure that the due diligence that was done was sufficient of a due diligence. So it's kind of a continuum where the passport follows the product through the union.
Okay, and to be fair, we are operating, we are dealing with this regulation in a landscape that, to be fair, the EU has not really been clear about, and they are struggling. They were supposed to issue guidelines. The law comes in at the end of this year, so under 6 months' time. We're still waiting for more guidelines clarification. I think there's been lawsuits, there's been lots of controversy about the implementation of this and the lack of clarity from the EU, the people that sit in Brussels, basically. So we are still, it is still a bit of an unknown generally, and we can only work with the information that we have. But Kristy, I'd like to bring you in now to the conversation, because ACM posted a very interesting video this morning on boundaries and mapping farms, and you said boundaries about farm boundaries about people as much as farms, and to the untrained eye the boundaries are not visible, to the farmers know where the boundaries are. So the difficulty is in the mapping, isn't it, of the farms. And as we say in your slide presentation, which will be available to viewers afterwards, deforestation can only happen on the farm, but compliance has to be owned by an EU entity, which is not the same entity that participates in farmers. So what's the I know you've done a lot of work on the ground. So what's the situation there for the farmers, would you say, regarding this EU law?
Yeah, thanks very much, Tony. It's a great question, and it's one that we've been engaging with, honestly, for many months now, because it kind of gets back to your question before: is this a top-down, scenario when it comes to compliance? I think that there are two, one of the complexities and maybe the confusions of the regulation that we've all been talking about, and that Peter has been really diving into, is the fact that so much of when the entity that places the due diligence statement on with the customs authority in the European Union has to be an EU registered entity. But all of the data that goes into that due diligence really has to come from outside the EU. And so in our case, Africa is our area of focus. And so all of the work that happens around data collection and data management and reporting and understanding the scenarios of deforestation or no deforestation happen outside of the European Union. And they generally happen at two different levels for both sides of the regulation, whether it's the deforestation side or the legal side. So just, to give you a bit of a sense of how we work when it comes to compliance, we really, if you're talking about the proved deforestation free side of the regulation, we've got to do a country level analysis and we have to do a farm level analysis. And that involves really different data sets. We've got to understand if there's a national deforestation policy, for example, know the general deforestation risk across the country. But then, of course, the EUDR requirement, the data requirement is for farm level geolocation data. And so you've got to constantly toggle back and forth between country level analysis and farm level analysis. And the same is true for the other half of the regulation that Peter discussed before, which is proving your commodity is legally produced. We have to answer some questions at the national level. What is the national legal framework that applies here to the various categories that the EUDR demands, compliance with? And then, of course, there's farm level analysis as well that we need to understand about land tenure, supplier relationships with customary authorities, and so on and so on. So it's the answer of what's happening on the farm is really a complex one to answer because, or the question of what's happening on the farm is because, so much of this happens in conversation with data sets that are gathered at other scales, particularly the country scale, the national scale. I'm grateful that you mentioned the video series because one of the things that I did was walk a farm boundary with a cocoa farmer in Ghana's eastern region because we weren't there to polygon map, but I was there to have the experience myself of doing the exercise of walking a farm boundary. And one of the big takeaways I got from this journey was that you need the farmer there. If you don't have the farmer there, then the boundary is, impossible to validate. The complexity of a farm boundary when it comes to especially smallholder crops like cocoa or coffee is really exists in it exists in the real world, but it's in the farmer's knowledge where that boundary lies. And so, property is about boundaries, and to know really with reliability and validity where the boundaries lie, I think is a very, very complicated exercise, and it requires the farmer's participation, which comes at a cost.
Absolutely. And Peter, we may be kind of going around in circles a bit here, but it's because it's so unclear as to really the state of the regulation. But one of the questions again that we've had from viewers is, where does due diligence happen? Compliance due diligence all happens based on data from Africa, but the responsible party that owns that due diligence statement must be registered in the EU. Peter, do you see, is there a disconnect there with this? Is it a fundamental flaw, or will it work? Will it all work as it's supposed to at the end of the year and when it comes in?
Yeah. It is a slightly odd situation because you have, generally a country will regulate laws for people who are within the boundaries of that country. And I'm talking about the EU as if it's one particular country. Here we have a country or union of countries which is regulating activities which are happening outside of its boundaries. So I'd say there are two critical components to this thing. The first is cooperation. And there is going to have to be a large amount of cooperation right across the supply chain. So from the farmer who produces the product to the consumer who consumes the product, at every step of that supply chain, there's going to have to be cooperation. It's simply not a situation where people inside the EU can say, well, you are outside the EU, you have to comply. And then the people, the farmers and the cocoa boards can say, well, the compliance only starts when the product lands within the EU. It's simply not that sort of situation. There is going to have to be a culture of cooperation that develops in order to ensure that the aims of these regulations are met. Secondly, the critical thing, and this is where we start talking about the solution to the complexity, I think the other critical component is trust, because you are having people within the EU, and there could be a whole lot of people within the supply chain, having to accept a due diligence report from someone else that comes from outside of the EU, where they haven't been there to do the polygon mapping, to check there's no child labor, to check with zoning issues, to check with, quite frankly, the very complex and very different way in which land law works in Africa. So there is going to have to be a situation where there is trust that the information that you're receiving from outside of Africa can be trusted within the EU. And I think that's where the solution that ACM is developing at the moment, the legal frameworks, the deforestation frameworks, are frameworks on which people within the EU are going to be able to rely. And that passport can then be handed on from one person in the supply chain to the next. So yeah, it is a complex and strange situation, but I think the goals and the aims are good, and I think if it's approached in the correct way, with the correct frameworks and with the correct partnerships, I think that these are regulations that can serve the goal which they're intended to. And sorry, just to one more thing, talking about the difficulties once product lands in the EU, is one also has to look at the penalties for non-compliance, and those penalties are quite drastic. So anyone who distributes product within the union without having the proper due diligence can lose up to 4% of their EU income. They can have product confiscated, they can have revenue confiscated, they can be barred from doing work within the union, from distributing product in the union again. So there are very serious consequences once the product is in the union, and that's why it's critical to have trusted partners outside of the union who are going to give you information which is correct and on which you can rely.
That's a very good point. And yeah, the EU have been very clear on the penalties. That's very, you know, on the consequences of not complying. But again, they've not been that clear on the solutions and the methodology and who's paying for all of this, and those things are still to be answered. A couple of points just while I have you. First of all, I'd like to make clear that we're talking about Africa, West Africa, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire. For these purposes, but the regulation is across all regions, South America, wherever these commodities are grown, and not just cocoa. But we are focusing at the moment, because this is where a lot of the problems are. We're focusing on cocoa. There's other commodities, and we are concentrating on West Africa as well, because that's where the problems are. Staying with West Africa, you mentioned the passport, and maybe you'd like to offer some comparison with the Kimberley Protocol for diamonds. I mean, do you know a little bit about that? That passport is, I guess, proof that it hasn't been mined under what would we call child labor, or anti-slavery issues. I mean, is that a good system to follow, do you think?
Absolutely. I think there are some similarities with the Kimberley Protocol. As you say, each diamond which is produced in Africa undergoes a certification process, and if it achieves the Kimberley certification, that is something that can follow the diamond throughout its life. The complexity with the kind of products that we're talking about, cocoa, coffee, wood, cattle, these products generally don't end up with the consumer in the same format in which they were mined or cut. They are mixed with other things and blended with other things. And part of the complexities that come in with the regulations is the regulations recognize that specifically in the cocoa, in the coffee, in fact, for any of the product, you could have a mixture. So you could have someone in the supply chain or manufacturer who says part of my product has been certified, part of my product hasn't been certified. So yeah, the Kimberley Protocol is probably a good comparison, but it doesn't offer a complete solution for the kind of products that we're discussing at the moment.
Okay, Kristy, back to you. Who bears the risk of compliance? And I'd like to ask you that in context of your new company, African Cocoa Marketplace. And I'd like you to just explain, give you the opportunity to, what is the ACM offering to traders and operators that perhaps other solution providers are not?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a great question. Who bears the risk of compliance? The way the regulation is written, ultimately the risk has to lie with the operator or trader or authorized representative placing the due diligence statement with the appropriate, customs authority within the European Union. So in that sense, it is whoever is bringing that product to the European Union market that ultimately bears the risk of compliance. But we can also flip that and say the farmer also bears the risk of compliance. This is the person who's ultimately has their market access, on the line here, and they're already I've had people explain to me scenarios where farmers are already getting very upset and believing that their already kind of meager livelihood, if they're a smallholder, is now at terrible risk, and that they will not be able to sell cocoa or coffee or what have you anymore because the European Union doesn't want their good. And so, there's already an emotional layer to this. There's already, obviously, like psychologically, that's a really difficult thing for a smallholder to bear, to say, suddenly is out of the clear blue sky, a new rule has come along saying we might not take your product anymore. And so I think
Has there been a breakdown in trust, would you say, at this stage, or is that something that could happen because of this law?
I think it's something that could happen because really, frankly, Tony, the awareness is of the EUDR's existence is still not very widespread, at least in the cocoa areas that I've worked in the last 12 months. I mean, there's still a lot of community entry and a lot of community engagement that needs to happen to even explain to farmers that this is something that exists now. And so I would say the potential for the breakdown of trust is still ahead. I'm talking anecdotally at this point about individual circumstances of farmers that I've either experienced myself or heard of being very upset by this regulation, but there hasn't been like a wide scale campaign to explain it at the kind of ground level, and at least that I'm aware of. And so I think there is still this massive potential for farmers to be put at risks that the regulation itself doesn't anticipate. And whether those are psychological risks or material risks in terms of their income, maybe it's a combination of all of those things. But in terms of what we offer with our solution, that is different, is really that understanding is that, everybody who works on our team is very experienced with African agriculture. Most of us have, dedicated our careers to field work, to understanding from the ground up what happens in African agricultural systems and African property law. And this is the advantage we have, is understanding the realities on the ground, understanding the legal frameworks, the legal structures, how things work when it comes to land use, and seeing this from the perspective of the lawmakers and the farmers themselves, who are ultimately impacted by this legislation.
Good, thank you, Kristy. And Peter, we're coming close to the end of this session now, but probably not one for you that you can answer, because it's probably one for the EU. But are you aware of how is this, when we have all this data and it's presented to the EU, what format is it presented in? Is it in a spreadsheet? Is it on a database? Does it go up? Who has to go? Or does it go into the country of origin, like Germany or Holland, or does it go to the central Brussels whole bureaucracy down there? But I'm not sure if this is one for you. It's probably one for the EU itself. But what would your advice be to the operators, producers that have to collect all this data, verify it, and then where does it go from there?
Those are great questions. And I think this is where one of the difficulties is going to come in for the EU, in that the regulations define competent authorities any different nation in the EU. So it's really going to depend on the port of entry. So you might find some countries being more strict on the paperwork that they require, and some countries being less strict. So again, you know, part of any solution to this issue is going to have to be around about understanding not only the EU, but the port of entry. So that's an important component. Secondly, you know, there's kind of there's three components to the due diligence that must be carried out. The first component is a gathering of information, and there's a whole list of documents that you have to get together and information. Secondly, there's a risk assessment that you have to carry out. And then the operator or the trader has to reach the conclusion that the risk of deforestation or legal non-compliance arising from that product is nothing or negligible, which is an extremely high bar. And then the third component is if the operator or the trader reaches the conclusion that you haven't reached that high bar, then you get to risk mitigation, where you can say, well, what can we do to mitigate the risk? But that is, just from that short description, you can see that there's an enormous amount of documentation and analysis that lies beneath that. But what the EU will really be looking for, and again, this is just my understanding, I'm not sure how it's going to work in practice from country to country, is they'll be looking from a declaration either by the operator, the trader, or the authorized representative saying, we have carried out this due diligence. These were the results of the due diligence. But I think the data will remain with the operator or the trader or the authorized representative. And then the other important aspect is that person who is providing the solution needs to retain that data for a period of 5 years, because for 5 years, the EU could come back to you and say, we want to have a look at that data.
Wow. Okay. Well, this is I think we shall wrap it up there. As I said, this was a bite-sized deep dive into the EUDR. There's been lots and lots of webinars, discussions, articles, debate, arguments, lawsuits flying around about this.
And more to come.
More to come as we get nearer the deadline. But I'd just like to wrap. We've answered pretty much all the questions that have come in, so thank you for those. And I'd just like to finish by inviting viewers to take part in this was our first ACM webinar. It was a free one. We're going to run more, probably the next one in July. And we'd like to invite viewers to take part in a poll and choose a topic for the next webinar, which I think Kristy has available now. So if you could answer that before you go, follow ACM on LinkedIn and find out about the work that they are doing to help farmers and operators and producers navigate this this complex law. They're working with some great partners. They'll have their due diligence compliance solutions up and running if they're not already. And just a reminder that you can watch this webinar on demand on YouTube, and some of the slides provided by Kristy will also be available for download. So thank you very much for watching, and so for this very first one, thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.